One other scenario that's probably not as straightforward is the scenario where you have a complainant, so a more junior employee potentially making an allegation against a respondent, a more senior executive in the business. Sometimes what you'll find is you won't have a willing complainant. So there could be this imbalance of power that I described, and this could be reported by a third party, but it could have hugely significant reputational consequences for the organisation. In that scenario, there will be an imperative to understand if this could in any way, by way of almost like a preliminary assessment, could in any way be substantiated. Because once you go down the road of involving unwilling participants in a meaty investigation with significant allegations and potentially significant consequences for those implicated, it's very hard to get that back on track. So sometimes there's a little bit of preliminary work that you guys support us with that forms the basis of a no-go decision in relation to something that could be potentially very serious, that clearly organisations want to kind of almost, in legal speak, kind of establish some form of prima facie case, which mightn't always be the case. That's very tricky, where you know or you reasonably suspect that who would ordinarily be the complainant in this scenario will not put themselves forward as the complainant. And that's where technology actually is vital.
Yeah, no, it plays a really big role in it. Last scenario then would be a situation where you might have allegations of financial impropriety, or movement of funds around the business. That's another common one. Again, would you mind sharing your experience on that? What way does that typically play out?
It generally, something like that generally raises its head through a kind of a whistleblowing type complaint. So it could be an anonymous complaint, it could be a complaint whereby we know the identity of the person making the disclosure, but it would undoubtedly fall in that type of scenario within the definition of a protected disclosure. So that creates more complexity for an organisation because of the confidentiality obligations that a company will have in that type of scenario. So where your team play a really significant role is at the start of that process. So to determine what ultimate employment process we follow as to whether something is or is not a protected disclosure, which is an exercise that does need to be carried out before you decide what process to follow, because obviously, as most people will be aware listening, those that make disclosures have very significant rights and protections against retaliation and penalisation, and they also have an inherent right to confidentiality, and those that are identified in a disclosure also have an inherent right to confidentiality. So a lot of the time organisations really struggle with how to manoeuvre that because of the fact they need to engage their finance teams, but their finance teams potentially could be implicated, or so there's a whole host of things that need to happen. And what I find is helpful involving your team is you can do a lot of that work in the background while being mindful of your confidentiality obligations, establishing it's quite similar actually, irrespective of the nature of the allegation that you're dealing with. You're trying to establish a credible timeline, and doing that through a forensic analysis that is very difficult to question after the fact, with a very robust backstory to that, also is incredibly helpful in a whistleblowing scenario, because it enshrines the confidentiality. It protects the organisation against any allegations that anything was done that shouldn't have been done, in terms of identifying somebody who's made a disclosure, or identifying even the wrongdoer in that scenario has obviously very significant protections. So all of that is at play. So the more you can harness the forensics that sit behind that before you go into a kind of a full-on proper investigation or forensic audit or whatever you ultimately decide to do, the more groundwork you can do through the systems that you have in place, the better, quite frankly.
Yeah, it's all about early case assessment there, if you can, if possible. I think from my own perspective, just the experience on that is those issues tend to be going on in the organisation over a period of time before they manifest themselves, and it's escalated to, the whistleblower raises it, or comes on the doorstep of the legal team. So it's typically fragmented across systems as well, because they've been doing numerous things in order to be able to do what they wanted to do. So targeting the data is absolutely critical. We obviously work really closely with you, the employment team, and the client as well, who will play a role in it. Like, they know where their information sits in the business, so we'll work with them to do it. And one way that most people will be familiar with is keywords. Keywords are still used, still good to try and find the documents that you want. We are now augmenting that with AI to help speed up the process. And one of our recent cases, we used AI in a scenario where we had 3 mailboxes, or 2 mailboxes, I think it was 3 Teams messages. There's about 200,000 emails, typical working documents, PowerPoints, all that mixed into it. And we did our typical analytics that we would do, and we got it down to 93,000. And from there, then we used Gen AI with the legal team to develop prompts and develop themes to go in and see, could we actually surface key documents quickly? And one of the really positive things that came out of it was it did identify 2 invoices, that the same invoice number and the same invoice date, but someone had changed something on the invoice, and we were surprised it even detected that. And it picked it up, along with then overall it really kind of circumvented the review, because it got it down to kind of maybe 1,500 critical documents after running the prompts. And then from there you do your manual review and you're into the legal analysis, but it really shortened the time frame. So for me, that could take 8 to 10 days, that kind of a volume roughly. I think we were there about 3 or 4. So that's going to get much better as well. Like, in the next month or two, some of the vendors are bringing out AI that's going to be able to help with the ECA, exactly what you were looking for there and you're speaking to. I know we do it well, but I think we could do a lot better with better tools. So that's a space to really watch.